Okay, can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
And that's my dog right on cue. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome. My name is Kat Allen and this talk is called Data Privacy, It Matters. Okay, so quick disclaimer. So all these views expressed are entirely my own. They don't reflect that of my employer, any affiliations, Women Who Code. This is specifically just my opinion, but I'm here to inform you guys. Hopefully this will inspire some thoughtful conversations and further research on your own end. Okay, so quick introduction, a little bit about me. So my education, I have a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Northern Illinois University. I actually, in a previous life, was a professional equestrian. So rode a lot of horses, unfortunately had a career-ending injury. At that point in my life, I decided that I really needed a change. My brother, who is a software engineer, suggested I explore something like a coding bootcamp. So I went on to graduate from Coding Dojo. So I learned 3 full stack languages in 4 months. I attribute most of my success to learning how to code. I think it completely opened my mind and like changed my perspective in a lot of ways. Which brings me to, why I'm here with talking with Women Who Code. Really passionate about helping other women, especially people who are looking to change careers. As you guys all know, there's not a whole lot of women in technology. I also work in cybersecurity. There's even less women in cybersecurity than there are in technology. So my day job, I am a senior product marketing manager at Forcepoint. We are a cybersecurity vendor. And then I also have my own company that I founded last year, mid-pandemic. It's called Allen Digital, and the logo is inspired by my dog, Cooper. He's a Doberman. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And then also really quick on the Coding Dojo side. So really, my interest in data privacy sparked from my days at Coding Dojo. I had this really cool instructor named Othman. And every time that he would teach us something, he always made a point to kind of bring it home in real life. And I remember him saying one day to me, you don't understand how important data privacy is because you're not like me, you're not a Black Muslim. And so just kind of listening to him and how much he struggles with going to airports and getting, constantly stopped and constantly questioned, it really kind of made me wonder and made me curious about, okay, why is that happening? So that's kind of what started my journey into data privacy. Okay, so kind of an intro. So if the digital future is to be our home, then it is we who must make it so. So great book by Shoshana Zuboff, who's a Harvard professor, called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Basically, surveillance capitalism, it talks about this concept of in the economy, we have moved from the days of manufacturing goods and being sold to now it's all about harvesting data and selling that without really giving people the right to understand what that transaction really looks like. So there really has been this economic shift that's happened so suddenly and so subtly, and it's happening very much in the background, right? So this is kind of the preface for why we need to talk about data privacy and what's going on in that realm. So what is data privacy? So data privacy, according to Cloudflare, another great company in the tech space, it's the ability of a person to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent personal information about them is shared with or communicated to others. So where does the data come from? So it's really important to understand that personal data is collected as the byproduct of people interacting with technology. So your smartphones, your smart watches, your smart TVs, your Ring doorbells, your Nest, your car, all of these things are gathering and collecting data on you and sending it back to a database via telemetry, right? So why data? Well, it's super cheap to mine, right? Because thank you to social media being so widespread, it's very easy to get data on people. People are very willing to share and overshare. It's unusually durable, right? So once you collect it, thanks to things like the public cloud, like AWS and Azure, you can just infinitely scale and just keep purchasing more databases versus Not that long ago, about 20 years back, you'd have to actually have a whole server room and then manage your own hardware. So it's become infinitely easier and cheaper to scale. And basically this has led to companies just hoarding data, mountains and mountains of data. Even if they don't know what they're going to do with it or why they need it, they're hoarding it because it's cheap and it's just easy to keep and maintain just in case they need it in the future. And it's also highly profitable, right? You hear things like data-driven or analytics. These things are constantly driving our economy, allowing companies to kind of optimize the user experience. So data is very, very valuable. I'm sure you've heard that it's kind of the new oil. And data can also come from legitimate and illegitimate sources. So it's important to remember that legitimate sources like social media. So anything you post on Facebook, you should probably be well aware by now that it's publicly available. However, there are also all of these recent cyber attacks that are happening too, right? So it's not just the legitimate data you need to worry about, it's the data that's also being stolen from companies that's sitting out there on the dark web. So this is one of my favorite quotes from one of the really good book that I recommend called Privacy is Power. So if your personal data ends up in the wrong hands, it can ruin your life. There is no way to foresee disaster, and once it happens, it's too late. Data cannot be recalled. So why should we collectively care? So 3 kind of big categories that we're going to unpack here in a minute. So first off being the abuse of privilege and power, and there's kind of 2 sections to that. So in my mind, it's the abuse of privilege of power of each other, and then it's also the abuse of privilege and power from government entities. Then there's also damage to individuals, companies, and society. And then also protecting your data protects everybody. So I'm sure we've all heard this, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So let's start with the abuse of privilege and power of each other. So these are some things that, whenever I hear somebody say something like, I have nothing to hide, I think that they aren't necessarily thinking about the bigger picture, right? So from 2010 to 2019, 23% of all American killings were domestic homicides, right? So, a lot of people are very lucky and they don't experience these things, right? But I think the propensity for damage is something that's really important. In the pandemic alone, so from 2019 to 2020, domestic violence related shooting deaths in the following states increased dramatically. So you can see Texas, 69%, Maryland, 93%, Missouri, 67%, and Utah, 160%. So when you think about all of the ways that you could track somebody or that you could, basically track them with their own digital media, domestic violence is something that I think is really important that we need to highlight. And then there's also the less reported, the harder to catch crimes, right? So there's things like stalking, cyberbullying, even human trafficking and child grooming, especially on these social media platforms. So it's really important to understand, especially when we start putting technology in the hands of our children, it's really important to understand what is data privacy, where is that data going, and then who are these people interacting with online? Then there's the abuse of privilege and power from a government standpoint, right? So probably the most popular example was Edward Snowden. So he was a former computer intelligence consultant who leaked classified information from the NSA in 2013 when he was working as a contractor for the CIA. So basically he felt the need to expose global surveillance programs. He didn't believe that they were, that was okay, what was happening. And so it took 7 years, but in 2020, it was actually ruled that it was completely unlawful, those bulk surveillance data programs. But to kind of prove my point, Edward Snowden has been hiding from the United States government for the last 7 years. So technology moves very quickly, the government moves very slowly, right? So even if you think that you're doing the right thing, it might not necessarily be within the confines of the law at any given time. And then it's also really, really important to remember that local, state, federal, and clandestine agencies also have access to social media. I think it's also kind of a very quiet, often not talked about thing, but most of the major tech companies do have government contracts where they do share and sell data back and forth, basically, right? So just always keep in mind anything you share online, that is data that can and will be used against you, right? And then also kind of the question of who's watching the watchers, right? Because even though these people work for the government, at the end of the day, they're still people, right? And so there is all this propensity for who's watching the watchers, because there is a lot of potential for abuse of that power, especially when we start getting into some of the technologies that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so some of the headlines to kind of highlight some examples. So damage to individuals, companies, and society. So in 2015, I don't know if anybody's heard of the website called Ashley Madison, but basically it's designed to connect people looking to have illicit affairs. Unfortunately, this website was hacked. 32 million records were stolen. And according to Bade Secure, victims in the United States, Australia, and India were sent emails that outlined very specific information about these individuals that the hackers threatened to take public if ransoms weren't paid in Bitcoin in a certain amount of time. So even though you may be using legitimate platforms, you may be doing things on there that you probably don't want to expose, right? So that's an example of data that's not from a legitimate source, but that's still being weaponized against people. Then there's also behavioral manipulation, which I'm sure, as you all know by now, because we probably all saw The Great Hack on Netflix, but the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2016. So I actually lived in one of the counties that Cambridge Analytica targeted at the time of this event. And I do have some pretty vivid memories of some of the things that I saw on Facebook at the time that actually prompted me to completely get off that platform altogether. So again, Cambridge Analytica had completely legitimate access to Facebook. There's kind of back and forth between, whether the company agreed to what they were doing or whether they were kind of like trying to pretend that they were doing something else in the name of academic research. But the reality is that it happened, right? They were basically doing a widespread social experiment in an attempt to swing an election. So other problems with big data, some really important examples that I wanted to highlight. So in 2018, there's this San Francisco-based company called Strava. They announced an update to their global heat map of user activity that displayed 1 billion activities of people wearing wearables like Fitbits. So it wasn't until a student in Australia studying international security began tweeting a series of images that showed Strava user activity potentially linked to US military bases located in Afghanistan, Turkish military patrols in Syria, and possible guard patrols in Russian operating area of Syria. So then we kind of realized there might be a problem there, right? So all of a sudden, fitness trackers became a national security concern. And it wasn't even the government that noticed it. It was some random kid in Australia tweeting about it, right? So again, we need to be very careful about the things that we're doing. And when we're building stuff in Silicon Valley, that mantra of move fast and break things, definitely a lot of things being broken, right? And then 2018, another one of my favorite examples, the ACLU basically set out to understand just how accurate facial recognition technology is. In particular, they were studying the Amazon version called Recognition. And basically the result was that it incorrectly matched 28 members of Congress, identifying them as other people who had been arrested for a crime. So some other kind of interesting tidbits, not that I want to scare you guys about your home devices, but big tech is very much watching you. So home security cameras. So I'm not sure if you guys have read the privacy policy and your legal rights to the footage that they collect, but I suggest you do. You'll probably find some really interesting things in those privacy policies. Smart speakers. Ever wondered how Alexa knows how to respond when she hears your name? I'll give you a hint. She isn't just listening when you ask for commands. Smart meters and thermostats. So something really crazy that I learned recently. Did you know that your energy footprint is so precise, it can actually reveal which TV channel you're watching? And smart TVs, and back in 2015, actually, which now feels so long ago post-pandemic, but did you know the fine print on Samsung smart TVs back then actually says that their smart TV's voice recognition system will not only capture your private conversations, but it's also allowed to pass them on to third parties. So in my humble opinion, we aren't really ready for smart homes. If you're going to bring these devices into your homes, especially if you have children, I encourage you to very carefully consider whether the benefits outweigh the risks. Okay, and some of my favorite scary stories of software in existence that is actively being deployed today. Enough about hardware, let's dig into some of these technologies at a software level. So automatic content recognition. This is a software that's largely used by marketers. It's an identification technology to recognize content played on a media device or present in a media file. So for example, developers of an application can then provide personalized complementary content to viewers. But again, who are these developers? Think about the media you've consumed in the past year. It's quite a lot of information that you can kind of pull based on what somebody's watching, right? Then there's also cell site simulators, also known as IMSI catchers. So these are actually fake cell phone towers that trick cell phones into connecting to them, largely used by police and government entities. So they collect things like identification, location, phone conversations, text messages, and browsing history. There is evidence currently supporting that police in London are actively using this technology today. Then lastly, I want to touch on Pegasus spyware. I don't know if anybody else got the notification that they needed to update their iOS on their Apple devices yesterday, but this is actually why. So Pegasus spyware is a zero-click exploit for iOS devices, meaning that the user doesn't actually have to do anything on their device to become compromised. It was developed in Israel. The firm claims it was a tool developed to fight terrorism, but there's a growing concern that the software has already been misused, as evidenced by the discovery of it being deployed on 37 phones of activists, journalists, and business people. So I don't know if anybody remembers Minority Report, but there is this public sector conundrum, right? It's a public-private sector conundrum. So not all private sector companies are created equal, right? It's largely up to that leadership team to decide what you do with your data, what you don't do with your data, who you partner with, who you share it with. And then government contracts, right? It's really important to remember most of the big tech companies that you hear about have some sort of government contracts and data sharing contracts with government entities, right? And so basically what that's allowing government and law enforcement to do is circumvent due process. And then this kind of opens up that question for predictive policing, right? And so there's lots of war stories I've heard from former police officers. I don't feel comfortable disclosing that information because it's all hearsay, but I can say that there are technologies that have currently been deployed in this country that are about predictive policing, right? Which again, brings me to Minority Report. If you guys haven't seen it or you haven't seen it in a while, I recommend you go watch it. It's still very relevant today. All right, and then there's cybercrime and e-crime, right? So cryptocurrency has fueled this huge boom in ransomware. Organized crime has gone digital. So I hate to say it, again, kind of some more scaries for you guys, but the mafia, the cartels, and street gangs have taken to the web because they can scale faster and gain more profits. This has led to the growth of ransomware as a service. So the scary part is, again, you don't even have to know the technology. You just have to have the money to pay somebody who knows how to have the technology, right? And then hackers for hire is another thing that we're seeing in the cybersecurity industry. So since the beginning of the pandemic, cybersecurity organizations have reported an increased number of hackers posting on dark web forums that are looking for work. So basically, it's not that you just have to worry about who you're upsetting anymore, but you have to just worry about, anybody in your life who could be compelled to, go pay somebody to hack you. And then I want to touch on privacy policies, right? So you ever notice that button you have to click before you can sign up for a digital service? How those privacy policy links at the bottom of every web page. So those are called privacy policies. You should definitely read them. They're very important and they're very binding, right? So like one example here is like Google Chrome. Any Google product you use, you're agreeing to their terms of service, right? So essentially the only way for you to disagree with that policy is to not use those services. And then it's also really important to think about when you hear about companies like Google, Google owns Google Maps, they own Chrome, they own Android, it's all of these different entities, right? Different brands, but all the same entity that essentially rolls up to one umbrella. And then just some do you know sections. So these were just kind of some interesting facts that I wanted to pull from different sectors of data and why it should be important that you keep it private. So DNA data, for example, submitting your DNA to a testing company can allow them to claim ownership in perpetuity and use it in any way that they want. So pretty scary, right? Especially now that we know cloning is real, DNA manipulation. DNA is also not easy to anonymize. Researchers actually recently came out with a study that they showed having used publicly available data to re-identify over 90% of a DNA database. Insurance companies can also use this against you, right? So really important to think about, you don't necessarily know what your DNA says about you, but it could be shared with your insurance company. And then law enforcement can also use this information to circumvent due process. And once you give away your DNA, basically your entire family tree is exposed. Did you know about healthcare data? So transfer of data can be done without your consent. So from pharmacies, hospitals, doctors' offices, health apps, even internet searches can be shared. And they can be shared to or with researchers, prospective employers, or insurance companies. Or they can even decide to donate your records in the name of research to big tech companies. There's no guarantee that your data is not going to be linked back to your identity. Then you can also be the victim of a data breach, unfortunately. So for example, in 2015, there were over 112 million health records exposed on US citizens. And in 2017, criminals got access to medical records from a clinic and they blackmailed all of those patients. They even ended up publishing thousands of pieces of private information, even nude photos in some instances, right? So really important, especially when you're signing up at a new healthcare place or going to a new doctor, be aware of those policies and how they're, protecting your data. And then lastly, real-time tracking. So brick and mortar stores have been using eye trackers to optimize product placement in stores for years. A great example of this is someone like Miller Coors. They actually install eye tracking devices in retail stores to see where you look first, right? And that seems pretty innocent. But then when you move on to things like facial recognitions in stores to see who you are and connect that to all the other data that they have about you. And then also they have tech implementations to identify you based on the signal your phone gives out while in the store. So pro tip, turn off your Wi-Fi and your Bluetooth if you're not using it, especially if you're in public places that can actually emit a signal that can help to identify who you are. And then just some notable consumer data breaches that I think is really important to think about, right? Because since this is a technical audience, I'm sure you guys really understand the propensity of databases. And it's not necessarily about just one data breach, right? It's about when you take all of these data breaches together and you combine them, think about the propensity for all of that data that you have on those specific individuals. So in 2021, 533 million Facebook users' phone numbers and personal data was leaked online. 2017, the famous Equifax hack. And in 2014, one that we often forget about, the Target breach, which estimates between 70 and 110 million customers were hit by that data breach. So now enough with all the doom and gloom. So what are we doing about it, right? Because I think that there is hope on the horizon from a public and a private sector standpoint. So from a public sector standpoint, we are seeing some gains being made in regulation, right? So we've got things like GDPR, which is really kind of the monumental groundbreaking one that's really focused on the EU. California followed pretty quickly after that with CCPA and CPRA. And then recently, Virginia and Colorado also enacted their own regulations, as well as New York. I believe that one is in the process of being approved. And then on the private sector side, there are kind of companies that are kind of pushing privacy by design, which is all about, if you don't collect the data, you don't have to protect the data, right? And if you don't collect the data, then you don't have to necessarily worry about all of those things like, behavioral manipulation. With Proton Mail, you don't have to worry about your emails being scanned by advertisers. So there are companies that you can use their products instead of going to somebody like a Google or an Amazon, and that will help to kind of drive that privacy forward. And what can you do about it as an individual, right? So there's a lot of things out there that can be pretty scary, but at the same time, there are things you can do and steps you can take to protect yourself and your loved ones. So the first one, just be aware of your digital dust, right? It's safe to assume that anything you put online is going to become public at one point or another. So just be aware of that, right? Like if you don't like the idea of all of your Facebook photos being shared, then probably you shouldn't be on Facebook. Just think about the technologies you engage with, why you're engaging with them, and should you really be sharing the things that you're sharing? Pay for your technology. This is my favorite one, right? So the old adage of if you aren't paying for the product, you are the product is very true. So if it's a free product, it's pretty safe to assume that they are basically making their money from advertisers, which means they have to collect data on users. Read the privacy policy. This is my favorite one. I know it's super obnoxious to read all these privacy policies and almost overwhelming, but at the same time, I like to at least skim them. I like to read the parts to talk about what kind of rights they have to the data that they collect, what kind of data that they collect. If you don't like what you see in the policy, try to find that product from a different provider where you do agree with that policy. Go anonymous whenever you can, right? So like, this is a great example of like when I go to the grocery store, I don't give my phone number to add me to the loyalty program because we saw what happened to the Target breach, right? Like that basically, they keep all of the data that all of your purchases over your lifetime with them. So if you don't give them your phone number every time you go there, you may not save a couple dollars, but you might save your peace of mind. Use strong random passwords. This is another one where password guessing and password breaking is getting, unfortunately, much easier with automation and advanced AI. So make sure you use strong randomized passwords. I recommend a password manager for that. And then lastly, engage in thoughtful, respectful conversations about it, right? I think it's really important that we continue to raise awareness and talk about the things going on so that we can try to build that future that we want to see rather than going in the wrong direction. So what will it take for change? We kind of touched on this a little bit, but public and private sector collaboration, right? So we have to find that balance of making sure that we are, keeping our justice system intact, making sure that we are protecting things like due process, innocent until proven guilty. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that we're holding tech companies accountable. The way you can do that individually is by refusing to engage with or buy from corporations that are not being responsible in the technology that they're deploying. And secondly, a population that demands privacy, right? Because if everybody walks around and says, I have nothing to hide, collectively, the amount of data that they are providing is no longer going to allow anybody else to protect themselves. So basically, we have to protect each other by protecting ourselves. Or else, 1984. George Orwell, one of my favorite books. This is kind of everything that could potentially go wrong. This is a great book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. So thank you guys for listening. And if you want to learn more, there's some great resources like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. The ACLU also has some great resources. Two of my favorite books, Privacy is Power by Carissa Veliz and The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff.
Yay, that was so great. Thank you so much, Kat. So we're just going to open it up for Q&A now. If anyone has any questions to ask Kat, feel free to unmute yourselves, put them in the chat, whatever you feel. But I wanted to ask a question. So really quickly, I know that like my iPhones, and I know my Google phone does it as well, where whenever you're setting up a new password for any service or anything, it asks if you want to use like a really strong password, and it gives you like this randomized password. Do you suggest that? Because I asked that because it's going to be stored in my Google account. It's going to be stored in my Apple account. So what password manager do you recommend? Do you suggest not to do that?
So this is a really interesting question, because had you asked me 6 months ago, I'd probably have a different opinion. However, I was recently hacked, and it really is unfortunate because they hacked my iCloud account. Well, if you do something like a password manager in iCloud, guess what? If your iCloud account gets hacked, all of your passwords get compromised. So basically, by having my iCloud account hacked, they were able to get into both of my emails. They were able to get into social media accounts, which I had to go lock down everything, starting with my most important assets. So that being said, I highly recommend using a third-party password manager. And I recommend using a password manager where that's all that they do, right? Because that means that they're focused 100% of their time on making sure those passwords are secure. I personally use 1Password. I love it. I think it's great. I've never had an issue with it. I love the randomly generate. Like every time I create a new password, I have them randomly generate one, right? So then that way it's like, it's not influenced by anything personal that anybody could guess. And then I always recommend using as long of a password as possible, right? Because the more characters you use, the harder it is to crack. And they've actually said that you don't have to go as far as to use completely random ones, but you can just use like random words put together, and that's enough. But yeah, I recommend 16 characters or more. 1Password is what I use.
And 1Pass also like gives you the option for some specific accounts to have a one-time password on top of your normal password. Like, so it makes it like, it's like next level 2-factor authentication.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. And yeah, you're right. It's 1Pass. I keep saying 1Password and I'm not even saying it right.
It could be 1Password as well. I abbreviate it. We have a question from Tom. He enjoyed your talk, by the way. They mentioned, when you mentioned pay for technology, are you aware of any listing of the various paid versus free options for the various popular tech products?
So I think it really depends, right? Like I think the easiest examples to give would, like, instead of using Gmail, I would recommend something like Proton Mail. Proton Mail has servers that sit in Switzerland, so they're governed by different laws. They actually came out recently this week. They still can be compelled to collect certain sort of metadata information, but they actually encrypt everything and they don't collect data intentionally. So I'd recommend them over like a Gmail. If you're a marketer and you're doing things like with Google Analytics, I'd recommend moving to a cookieless analytics, which means you can also get rid of your cookie consents on your websites that are really ugly. I would recommend something like a Fathom Analytics. And then the easiest one for search engines, get away from Google, I'd recommend DuckDuckGo. Again, it's anonymized, they're not collecting your data. It's a back-end Bing, so like their ads are actually coming from Microsoft, but again, they're not doing behavioral-based ads, it's contextual-based ads. I'm trying to think if there's anything else, but yeah, I think those are my big three, unless you had a specific service you were wondering about in terms of a better privacy option.
No, just as a general list, it was great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
When you're talking about all the different security breaches that were, these mass amounts of data has gotten out, are there any specific ones that you think are especially bad, or is it kind of the combination of multiple, the fact that there's been so many different breaches that data could be compiled?
Yeah, so I think probably the most concerning, I would say, is Facebook, right? Because this isn't their first breach. I think it's their fourth or fifth breach. And so I think part of the challenge with this is that these tech companies keep making mistakes and we keep just forgiving them and continuing to use their services anyways, right? And I think it's interesting that, this whole big book came out about Facebook and the dangers of what Facebook does and how they build this technology. And then Mark Zuckerberg went on to talk about the metaverse, right? Like he didn't even acknowledge this whole book that came out exposing all of these problems at his company. So I think it's worrisome because of how many breaches are happening. It's also worrisome because it's, when you look at the types of data, like Facebook is very personal data, right? Like you're posting pictures of your kids, you're posting pictures probably where you're going, you're tagging places and people. Which then it's kind of like that idea of like 6 degrees of separation, right? So like, even though you may not consider yourself a target, you may know somebody who knows somebody who's in the military or who's in an intelligence agency who could be a target, right? And so I think that's the scary part, is that we just haven't really held these companies accountable, which is why the breaches just keep happening. So until we kind of start holding these companies accountable, I think unfortunately we can just expect to see more and more breaches happening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another quick question. So Kat, have you just stopped using all social media, or is there any social media that you still use, or what's your stance on that?
So I went cold turkey for a while, but I really love Instagram. I mean, I loved it before it was bought by Facebook. So I do use Instagram. But when I use social media, I do it in a browser. I don't download social media apps, right? Because when you start putting apps on your devices, you're giving them access to more information than you think that you are. So I always recommend, if you're going to use social media, do it through a browser. Same with LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, but I only use it through a browser. I don't use their application. So that's just kind of my trick. And then I'm also very cognizant of, like, I don't post, information about like my locations. I don't post anything in real time. So if I go somewhere and I take pictures and I want to post them, I always do it after I've left that place, right? Because you never want people to know real time where you are. Like, it could be somebody like who wants to rob your house and you posted you're on vacation. Like, they're going to go rob your house because they know you're not home. So just things like that, where it's like just little tricks you can use. Like, I realized, like, not using social media in 2021 is probably near impossible. I've tried it, I couldn't succeed. But yeah, that's my recommendation, use a browser. And DuckDuckGo actually just launched their own browser, which I love. There's like this little fire button you can use. And it basically, like when you press the button, it erases all of your cookies and your browsing data. So you can, it's kind of just like a reset button that's really nice. And yeah, so yes, I'm on social media. You can find me, Instagram and LinkedIn. But I'm, yeah, kind of rogue about it, so.
Awesome, good to know.
LinkedIn dangerous for people in general?
Okay, yes, and I totally forgot to put a slide in there. So yes, so LinkedIn is like the #1 social engineering of choice, right? It's really unfortunate, but like things like the pandemic with the way the labor market is, there's a lot of scams going on, a lot of social engineering going on where people are actually pretending to be companies looking to hire candidates, and then they're using that to get all of their information to then steal their identity, or then get access to somebody else that is a higher value target. So yeah, so be very careful. I recommend if you are going to use LinkedIn, be very cognizant of like what you leave publicly available, right? So like if you look at my LinkedIn, it's only my current roles. I probably shouldn't even have that, but I do. I don't share like my entire history unless I connect with people. And then my other kind of tip for social media is that if you are going to post personal stuff or you are going to have all your information on there, only connect with people you know in real life, right? Like it's very easy to spin up a social media account and pretend to be somebody you're not. So just be really cognizant of who you connect with. Like don't connect with 1,000 people on LinkedIn because half of them are probably not there for good reasons, so.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you again, Kat, for the fantastic talk. Once again, the links to join our Slack group can be found within the chat. But otherwise, thanks everybody for attending. Hope that you have a fantastic night. We look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.